Well, good evening. Be turning to page, what is it? 244 in your Bibles, or whatever Bible you have that has Joshua 18 in it. Thank you for being here tonight as we continue our march through the book. Joshua's 18 and 19 are going to be the focus of our study tonight. Much of this is similar to previous chapters, especially like the chapter discussing the division of the lands for Judah, because there's just a lot of markers here. We go from this spring to that tree to this valley to whatever. So we won't be reading all of those little markers that are pointed out. What is fascinating to me, and we'll learn why it's like this tonight, is that they were very specific. They knew exactly what the limits and bounds of their territory was to be. And so we're going to read a little bit about why it's that way and make sure that we understand that, God gave them the land, but they had to do some work to get to their particular place. And as we enter chapter 18, we find that the land is not really totally subdued yet. And so we'll be looking at that. So I tried to find a map that was a little clearer. And change it for me there. There it is. I don't know if you can read that any better than the former maps I've had, but we'll be coming back to this division. I want you to notice that all that's been really settled now are the big chunks. We've got Judah down here, we don't see the whole thing. And we've got Manasseh west and Manasseh east, and these tribes of Gad and Reuben, they have their land. But there's several tribes that haven't got their land yet. And all of the ones up here are yet to be figured out. And we have Dan and Ephraim, and Benjamin's already allotted. And the one that you don't see too well right here, Simeon. So there's several pieces of land when we come to chapter 18 that are not yet subdued. And we see that Joshua gets a little bit upset at the people. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're not clearing the land of the false teachers and the inhabitants that are there. God's given you this land, but you're not doing what you should be doing. And so as we go through this study tonight, we'll be looking at these different tribes in the section of land that they got. They didn't have any idea where they were going to end up. Gad didn't know that he was going, Issachar and Zebulun and Asher and Naphtali did not have any idea where they were going to end up until the lot came to them and God gave them that land. So let's read a little bit in chapter 8 and talk about some things here that I find interesting. We'll be reading starting in verse 1. Actually, what I'd like to do, I put it on 18, yeah. In chapter 17, go back to 17, and in verses 12 and 13, there's an interesting statement here. So Todd brought up the division there before and all of the things that are going on in getting Ephraim and Manasseh settled in. And verse 12 said, "Yet the people of Manasseh could not take possession of the cities because the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in the land." Now, when the people of Israel grew strong, but they put the Canaanites, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out. Now, is that a problem? It will be. It's going to be a major problem, and it's going to be a challenge to them. They didn't do if the Canaanites are staying there, what's also staying there? Their gods, their false worship, all of the bad things that God wants driven out of the land. And so with that backdrop, we come to chapter 18, and it says, "The whole congregation of the people of Israel assembled at Shiloh and set up the temple of meeting there, the land they subdued before them." So the tabernacle is what he's talking about here. And they set the tabernacle up at Shiloh, and if you've read through your Old Testament, you know that the tabernacle stays pretty much in Shiloh from now until it's set up and it's replaced basically by the temple itself. So Shiloh becomes a very important point in the history of the Jews. It must have been, I don't know the reason why it was set up there, other than that's probably where God wanted it set up. But the tent of meeting was the center of their life. That's where they were to come and give their sacrifices. They were not to build altars anywhere else. They were to come to the tabernacle. And so it's just interesting to me that God tells us this is where the tent of meeting is going to be set up. And we're going to see that it's outside now, the tent of meeting, that lots are going to be cast for these tribes that don't have their land. So in verse number 2, it says, "And there remained among the people of Israel 7 tribes whose inheritance had not yet been apportioned. So Joshua said to the people, 'How long will you put off taking possession of the land?'" What were they waiting for? God has told them to go in and take the land, but they're not doing it. It says, "How long is it going to take you to take possession of the land which the Lord your God, your fathers, has given to you? Provide 3 men from each tribe, and I will send them out. They will set up and go to and fro through the land, and they will write down a description of all that they view to divide the inheritance." Verse 5, "And they shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall continue in his territory to the south, and the house of Joseph shall continue in the territory to the north." What he's talking about, of course, is Judah. Pop back here. We've got Judah to the north, to the south, Judah, and we've got Manasseh up here. It says they're not going to do anything with these 2 pieces of land, but we've got all this to take care of, we've got all this to take care of. So I need 3 men from each of the 7 tribes. How many men is that? 3 times 7 is 21. Thank you, 5th grade teacher. And so these 21 are going to go out, and they're going to write in the book all of the places that they find and all of the dimensions and divide this thing up. Now, it's interesting to note he doesn't give them specific directions, measure distances between springs and trees and mountains and valleys. He left that to them. But they were pretty much supposed to come up with 7 reasonably equal sizes of territory. So starting in verse 5 again, he says, "So you shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall continue in the territory to the south, and the house of Joseph shall continue in the territory to the north. And you shall describe the land in 7 divisions, and bring the descriptions to me, and I will cast lots for you before the Lord. The Levites have no possession among you, for the priesthood of the Lord is their possession. And Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh shall receive their inheritance beyond the Jordan, which Moses, the servant of God, gave them." So you can hopefully see from the map, which you've looked at many, many, many times, I'm sure, is we've got this territory that's already been apportioned, and then we've got Manasseh, Manasseh must have had a lot of kids, because you got territory based upon the size of your tribe. So you got Manasseh with people over here and people over here. Ooh. But Ephraim, his brother, he's just a small little family. But the rest of this land has to get divided, and that's what this chapter is really getting into. So as we're going through this, I'll bring all these up so we can see all the details there. The Levites don't get a piece of land because of why?
Because they're the priests and they have to be among all.
They need to be spread out among all the people. Yep, and they get cities, but they don't have a dedicated city-state, if you will. They have to divide themselves among, and there's no real specific detail in here as to what Levi tribe went here and what Levi clan went there. They were just to separate themselves between the people. And so we see in the next few verses here that the men went out and as Joshua had charged, and wrote the description of the land, saying, "Go up and down the land and write a description and return to me. And I will cast lots for you before the Lord in Shiloh." So again, Shiloh plays an important role. So the men went up and down and passed through the land and wrote it in a book, great description. I don't know if they stayed together. I don't know if all 21 stayed together, if they divided themselves up. It doesn't give us any detail. And I would not think they're all together. There's a lot of territory to walk around with 21 people. We don't know. But anyway, they return, And they came to Joshua in the camp of Shiloh, verse 10, and Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord. And there Joshua apportioned land to the people of Israel, each to his portion. And so now, finally, at the end of chapter 18, we have all of these tribes apportioned a land. But some of these lands, especially up here in the, I should have put a second map in there. This area up here at the top, this is going to give them some trouble. They don't cast out all of the Canaanites. They don't get rid of all of them. And they have a problem down in this area as well, but we don't know much about that particular piece of history. It's just that they needed to do some extra work. They were kind of assuming, I think, God was going to take care of it for them. But God doesn't work like that, does he? God says, go out and do this, and we don't step back and, like evangelism, we don't step back and say, okay, God, there's the city of Ponca City. We're ready to receive. That's not how he works. We have to go out and we have to do the work. So if we kind of perceive the community that we live in like they were supposed to, they had to go out and do the work. They had to drive the Canaanites out and the other peoples that were living there, just as we have to go out among the community and bring Jesus to them. And so we see here that God has given them the land. They have to go out and pursue and conquer the land. And then once they have it, the land is now divided. There's never an indication anywhere here where there was a dislike for the land that a certain tribe got. And we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, but why do you think there doesn't seem to be any problem with receiving the land that you got? And it says that Joshua was before the tent of meeting, and he was casting those lots, and you had Joshua and you had the high priest, and they were before the Lord. Did that add credibility to the process? So they assumed, I believe, that whatever lot they received was the allotment that God wanted them to have. And that's always been kind of amazing to me that while they squabbled and fought among themselves and whatever, there never seems to be an indication that they didn't like or didn't want what their allotment was. So now they're spread out. They all have their portion. And we step into verse 11 here, and we now see Benjamin get his little piece. Who's a famous person in the New Testament that was a Benjamite? Remember? It was Paul, great apostle Paul. He was a Benjamite. Verse 11, and the lot of the tribe of the people of Benjamin according to the clans came up, and the territory allotted to them fell between the people of Judah and the people of Joseph. And when he says the people of Joseph, he means that tribe of Ephraim that's above there. And so starting here in verse 12 now, we have the guys with the telescopes and the measuring chains set up. And they're going to lay out exactly, on the north side, where the boundary began at the Jordan, and we start there, and, they go so far, and they take a left, and they go to the right. And the rest of this is just a description of how they measured out the tribe of Benjamin, which is lying, kind of in the middle there. And they get their piece. It's just interesting to me. Like down in verse 15, they talk about the spring of the waters of whatever place this is, Nephtoth, we'll call it, Nephtoth. They were so precise. They went from this, and there's one place in here that talks about measuring from a tree to the base of a valley. And so this must have been a strange looking, we would call it gerrymandering today. It looks really strange. But each got their own piece of property specifically laid out, and this was the property that they were to possess and own. And so for the rest of chapter 18, as we note on the board, the details of Benjamin's allotment is given. And in the last verse there, the last part, it says, this is the inheritance of the people of Benjamin according to its clans. So remember, within each tribe, let's say the tribe of Benjamin, then there are the fathers, the heads of the clans. And then within the clans are sub-clans. And each of those was to get a portion to city or a general area. And they had to come up with their own plan to divide within the tribe. So here's where the tribal fathers were very, very important. And so they came up with their system to do that. We're not told exactly how that happens. And so by the end of chapter 18, we have the land now all allotted, and we start there seeing these 7 tribes get allotted pieces of territory. And if you have any comment, please keep me awake and ask the question. Starting in chapter 19 then, it says, and the second allotment came to Simeon, for the tribe of the people of Simeon, according to the clans, and their inheritance was in the midst of the inheritance of Judah. Remember, I won't flip back, but you remember Simeon is kind of in the middle. It's like a bullseye in the middle of Judah. And it states that Judah said, we have too much land, we have too much territory. And so they probably were involved in saying, you take this center section right here. I wonder if that was the better or the worse. But somehow that center section of Judah was selected. Now, there's one thing that we're going to talk about after a while, but remember that Simeon's kind of in the middle of Judah, and we kind of don't hear about Simeon much after a little while, because they were probably absorbed into Judah, because all of the commerce and everything was controlled by Judah, the larger tribe. So it's just kind of interesting that they're in the middle of a group and probably disappeared as a tribe, being absorbed into Judah.
John, I was just going to go back up to 18. At the end of there, it starts talking about Jerusalem, which my Bible said Jebus, that is Jerusalem. And so we've got at least the foundation of the city of David.
Yeah.
Even though it's considered part of Benjamin, it's kind of right on the border.
It's one of the
Right, and so, but it's amazing, and like I said last week, when you read about David and Jerusalem, they're still fighting with the Jebusites in that city
and
from that time forward.
And they don't gain a foothold until David comes along and finally beats the Jebusites, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So this doesn't mean that it's a simple, easy process. They struggle. God just doesn't say, all right, it's taken care of. They are expected to go out and work. And I think there's just a bunch of little lessons that pop into my mind. As I said before, God doesn't say, here it is, here's the bed of roses for you. He gives us a challenge and then expects us to overcome the challenges in our work. And so there's where working together, working with a plan, working according to Scripture, and those kind of things. So there's really a lot of little lessons that come from this study. And so we see here that Simeon now gets that little piece in the middle, and starting in verse 2, it starts laying out the markers. It forms kind of a circle as to what their piece of territory is going to be. And again, we won't read into all of that, but it's noted there. I'll read here, starting with verse 9, and the inheritance of the people of Simeon formed part of the territory of the people of Judah, because the portion of the people of Judah was too large for them. The people of Simeon obtained an inheritance in the midst of their inheritance. So Judah got a big chunk of land, but they realized this is more than what we need. I don't know if God said you got too much land. I don't know. It doesn't say why they carved out this particular piece right there, but God obviously approved of it. So Simeon now, a lot like Benjamin, is going to really kind of be later included into what we call Judah as we go forward here. So in chapter 19, we've already talked about Simeon. Judah's land was too much for them. And starting with in verse 10, we see how these other tribes received a certain portion of land. Zebulun and all of the boundaries are listed here, and then Issachar and Asher and Naphtali and Dan. And it's just interesting. We don't know how the lot was given for a certain tribe. It just doesn't describe that process to it. But since there's no apparent argument or disagreement, I think there was a lot of trust in the process that was laid out before them. And I want to pause here for a minute and just ask you some general questions. Do we have the kind of trust in the processes that God has laid out for our salvation and for our obligations to Him? or do we want to come up with ways to change things and kind of do things differently? These people didn't seem to have a problem receiving what God gave them. They trusted the process. But people today, they don't always trust the process, trust the plan of salvation, trust what God is expecting of us. And I don't know if that is anything to you, but it means a lot to me. If God was that detailed, says this is your land and here are all of the specific boundaries for your land, it kind of says God was involved to that degree in just breaking up the land. How much more is God involved in setting up the boundaries for his people spiritually? He's got certain expectations for the way we live, for how we worship, for what we do, for how we treat each other, and just probably a whole list of things that we could think of. And so it just touches me that God was so precise in dividing the land. I can trust how precise he is in dividing up, or if you will, assigning us our task and our role. Lena?
Hadn't given this any thought until you said this, but the one thing that popped into my head is where, in the Bible, he says women are to be silent in the worship service. And I feel that today, in society, women, not within the church, but without the church, want a role in the worship service. And that's where I feel threatened when that movement wants to come into the church.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like that.
That's kind of moving a boundary, isn't it?
Yes.
Remember?
That is already in the church.
Oh, yeah, lots of things. Yeah, there's just so many differences, and that's what I'm meaning, is God has set up certain territorial boundaries. And we need to respect that. It seems to me that they respected the territorial boundaries given to them. We need to do the same thing within our worship, in our lives, and the things we believe and teach. We're going to get into something in a few minutes that might be interesting to you in that regard. Any other comments on that?
No, we just think so many times we're a lot wiser than God. That we can figure it out a little bit better because we've got more experience in life and so
Yeah.
forth. You know, we can bring more people in by doing it this way. You know, maybe they're not faithful, maybe they won't stay, but they're coming.
Yeah, it's
All kinds of things we come up with.
and if you wonder, why did God go into such detail in talking about every single one of these territorial boundaries? Goes into great detail that you don't enjoy reading it. Well, so why is it there? Well, one of the reasons that hits me is, like I said, if God is so specific in allotting territory, we need to pay particular attention to how God is specific regarding worship and life and obligations we have to him. So it goes with it.
I think it's interesting too, John, because, God's plan is for the Israelites to permanently be in this land.
Yeah.
But his foreknowledge knows that's not going to happen. So his overall plan is just to make sure that we have Judah, we have Jerusalem, where the Christ will come, and ultimately the law and the kingdom will come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's fascinating how he's setting all this up for eternity with the Jews, knowing that he's going to have to guard this one area to make sure the Savior that comes and ultimately saves the world.
And all the pieces are in place for that to happen, right? Well, you kind of got into an area I want to spend the next maybe 10 minutes or so talking about. And again, this is that same map we've been looking at. And we see all of these tribes and whatever here. What happened to them? What happened to these tribes? Where are they today? Well, it's interesting to me, and I want to talk about these things for a minute. God provided an orderly way to divide this land, and people adhered to it, as we've been talking. God provides order and method to everything that he does. before he created the heavens and the earth, he had a perfect plan. If you will, he ordered that creation. It worked out perfectly, just as he said. And the people accepted the division because they believed that God was blessing the process. And we talked about that a couple of times so far. So here we have a people that's been divided in this land of promise, a land that, Abraham was wandering through this land, and God says, I'm going to give your people this land, and your people are going to be like what? They're going to be like the sands of the sea. They're going to be like the stars of heaven. And here's a guy that doesn't even have one child. But look how God worked through that order and method. And now we have all this people spread through the land, and you think, man, God has blessed us. We're just going to worship him and do what he wants for the rest of our lives. And our generations to follow us are going to do we're going to only go to Jerusalem to worship. And it's like making all of these hollow promises, because that's not what happened. We know good and well that's not what happened. It's interesting also in chapter 19 that Joshua, remember Caleb wanted a mountain. He wanted a certain place, and God is also going to provide a place for Joshua. When they had finished distributing the several territories in the land and the inheritance, the people of Israel gave an inheritance among them to Joshua the son of Nun. By command of the Lord, they gave him the city they asked for, Timashera, in the hill country of Ephraim, and he built the city and settled there. So he gets a city. Of course, Caleb got the city, got a very large section of land. He ended up giving his daughters the springs at the top and the bottom of this territory. And so Caleb and Joshua received rewards for following what the Lord said. I think there's a great lesson there. They went through 45 plus years to get to that reward. But God didn't forget. God always remembers. And then the last part there in verse 51, these are the inheritances of Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the fathers and the houses of the tribes of the people of Israel, as they distributed them by lot at Shiloh before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And so they finished dividing the land. It's now done. Well, it's not all done yet. The division on paper is there. Now they've got to go into those places and chase out all the people that shouldn't be there. But I just like that. So they finished dividing the land. Finally, they get to the point where everyone has an allotment. And so the question is, what happened to these tribes? What happened to them? Well, remember some things that God said, and this is just a very quick summary. I've got about a dozen slides here, but we won't be able to get into them. God said that he would protect them as long as they what? Obeyed him. They could keep the land, and he would be like a hedge to them, keeping the enemies out, but they had to obey him, follow him, worship him, do what God has said to do. But if they allowed the enemies to, he would allow the enemies to invade them. They were to drive out the Canaanites and destroy all the idols and the places of worship. Did they do that? No, they didn't. They let too many hang around, and so they were going to have problems. As long as they did this, God would allow them to stay in the land. But what happened? And so an interesting little quick tour through history. Yep. Other things that happened there we'll get into. So during the time of the judges, Israel went through 7 different cycles. This is what the book of Judges is all about. 7 different cycles of God allowing invaders to come in, all kinds of different invaders. And they would conquer the land, and then their judge would be raised up, and they would be chased out. And the book of Judges is about 350 years in length. And so a lot of time goes by, where in the book of Joshua is kind of condensed into a few years. 350 years go by in the book of Judges. And God gave them chance after chance after chance after chance to follow him and to stay with him. But that's not what happened, is it? And so Saul was finally selected to be a king. And the reasons before that are, beyond our evening tonight. But the people wanted a king. And so God allowed Saul to become the king. And he reigned for about 40 years, but he had nothing but trouble. He started out okay, but he ended up going to the dark side, so to speak. And then following him, we have David. David reigned for about 40 years, but he had war and trouble. What was the reason that David wasn't allowed to build the temple? He was a man of war, a man of blood. And so God says, your son is going to be the one that builds the temple. And for the 40 years of his reign, things were relatively peaceful. There are incidents, that take place during those 40 years. But generally, during that 40 years of time, Solomon becomes incredibly wealthy. The land is generally at peace, and some good things are happening. But some bad things are happening too. And we know what happens to Solomon. He goes to the dark side as well. And who is Solomon's son? Rehoboam. You remember the other guy that comes along, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. How do you remember who goes with whom? Well, remember, if you can remember the two names, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, remember R is very close to S for Solomon. So R and S, Rehoboam, Solomon. Jeroboam, easiest way to remember him, he was a jerk. J goes with J. So you got Rehoboam and Solomon together, and then you got Jeroboam the jerk. And so we have Jeroboam allowed by God to take the northern tribes, and it's called Israel now, and they never did have a good king. Never did have a good king. And time after time after time, for about 250 years, God sends to them prophets. And what do they do to the prophets? They kill them. God tries again. He sends another prophet, and they run them out, kill them. And so that northern 10 tribes, which is not true, the northern tribes ruled by the descendants of Jeroboam, they were never good, never ever. They worshiped false gods, starting with Jeroboam setting up golden calves, at Dan and Bethel. Dan being really close to Jerusalem. Don't go all the way to Jerusalem. Stop here in Dan, and Bethel, you can worship here and not go down to Jerusalem. False worship was set up. Finally, God says, that's it. And in 721, God allowed the Assyrians to come in and conquer the northern tribes. They tried to take the southern tribes, but God did not allow that to happen, and the history of that is fascinating to me. You may be bored with it, but God did not allow that to take place. The Assyrians laid siege to Jerusalem, and God caused a turmoil in King Shalmaneser's family, who ended up assassinating the king. So and the Bible talks about that even. So the Assyrians were allowed to take the northern tribes. They take them into, they pull the people, for the majority of the people, out, settle them in other parts of Assyria, and those that remain there intermarry with other people that come in, and that's where the Sumerians come in. Remember the Samaritan woman? She was a product of that thing. And so they were kind of halfway there in their religion, and they weren't. So these tribes never returned to the promised land. They're gone. They're gone because they're not part of God's plan. As Todd said, God's focus is now on what tribe? Judah. On Judah. And through Judah is going to come somebody special, Jesus. And so God is now focused on what's happening in Judah. But even Judah doesn't remain faithful. And so we see here the northern tribes, they go into Assyrian captivity in 721. About 606, God allows some guy from Babylon, remember his name? Nebuchadnezzar. And he allows him, actually Nebuchadnezzar's, true in history, Nebuchadnezzar is a co-regent with his dad. Nebuchadnezzar's more of the general at this point, and he's the one that goes in and lays siege to Jerusalem. And we know the story from there, and conquers Jerusalem but doesn't destroy the city at this point. And then the people turn to get help out of Egypt, and they have this famous battle. And finally, Nebuchadnezzar says, nope, that's it. Go down and destroy the temple and everything. So the temple and the entire city is laid waste, forbidding anybody to live there. I mean, that's how bad it was. If you went to live in Jerusalem, they would execute you. But anyway, so by the time this 586, but in 606 was probably when Daniel is carried away, and Daniel and the good high stock, if you will, of Judah is carried away into Babylonian captivity. How long did God keep them in captivity? 70 years. And Daniel saw the beginning and the end of that. He was well preserved by the time this is over. And so we see a return then in 70 years later, return of people coming back. They rebuild Jerusalem, and we have the stories of Nehemiah and Esther that we've been reading in Scripture over the past few years. So they get to come back, but they never really become a separate country ruled by themselves again. They always have somebody over them, in this case Babylon, and then we have Alexander the Great that comes in. His territory is divided among 4 generals, so they never ever become a true kingdom again. They are allowed by the Romans to have a king, and that's Herod and all of that story. But it's just interesting that those northern 10 tribes never ever come into God's picture again. They've assimilated into the world. And there are some theories, and I'll go through this very quickly and we'll shut it down because if I don't, then we've got 20 more minutes of slides. But where did the lost 10 tribes theory come from? If you were to worship somewhere else, go to church somewhere else, you would most likely hear something about premillennialism in some way. And in the theology of premillennialism, the lost 10 tribes will return to Israel, and when that finally happens, then we'll be able to scrape off the Dome of the Rock and build Ezekiel's temple, and finally Jesus will come and live and reign on the earth for 1,000 years. All of this crazy stuff about a 1,000-year reign and the return of the lost 10 tribes can be dated back to the 900s. And it's interesting that there is a theology in Judaism that says that God has protected, and we can't see it, but God has protected in a country over in Central Asia, and we can't even see it today, but he's protected these lost 10 tribes, and they're still there, and they're protected by this river of fire and these restrictions that we can't see today. That was the theory in about 900. People bought into that. Well, then, it's very interesting that in English history, you know where the Norsemen came from? The Vikings? They're the lost 10 tribes. They're the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and they came in and took over England, and so England is now populated by the lost 10 tribes. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's actually part of English history, or shall I say theology. And there are several Christian denominations that claim that, like the American Indians, are a descendancy of the lost 10 tribes. And it's interesting to see how people have just kind of gone bonkers trying to figure out where the lost 10 tribes of Israel went. They went away a long time ago, never again to be brought into God's plan. So in actuality, they were assimilated into the Assyrian culture. And we could go into something I enjoy talking about, but God is in the process through Israel, through Judah, to bring Jesus into the world. Part of this great plan that he devised before he ever created time, space, and matter was to bring Jesus into the world. And that would be through the 10 tribes, and then through the 1 tribe of Judah, and ultimately the family line that we read about. So there are not 10 lost tribes. There's 12 of them that are lost. Why are they lost? Because they don't accept the Lord Jesus Christ. And Paul talks about this, and I've got a whole bunch of scriptures that talk about some of this. I'll close by saying this. There are people that are so locked into what happened in 1948 that they can't get their mind on the scriptures. England, or the United Kingdom, or the UK, or British, whatever you want to call it, those folks dominated and controlled what we call Palestine during and after World War II. And as the land was proportioned to different places, the odd lines that you see all over that place. Why does Iraq have this division, and Iran have that division, and Jordan have this. Well, that was laid out right after World War II, so these countries could kind of come back into existence. And one of the areas was Palestine. And there were a lot of immigrant Jews that didn't want to go back into Warsaw, Poland, and to some of these horrible places. And so they petitioned the British government to establish Israel. So in 1948, Israel became a country. And this, to many people, is the starting point for which the 10 tribes, all of the tribes, will now assimilate back into one place. But that's not the Israel of the Bible. The Israel of today over there has absolutely nothing to do with God's Israel. Who or what is God's Israel today? It's the church. And there's a lot of scripture that I won't bring up. But you and I, if we are members of the Lord's church, we are not connected by the blood of Abraham. We're connected by the blood of Christ. It doesn't make a bit of difference if you can trace your lineage back to Abraham. It makes every difference in the world on the day of judgment if you can trace your lineage back to Jesus and the blood that you came into contact with when you were baptized. Fascinating stuff. I'll leave the other slides alone. Otherwise, I'll be here for a long time. Sorry for going over, but I just wanted you to see that there are a lot of weird things being taught regarding those lost 10 tribes of Israel. I'll walk over here now.